For my side, I'd like to commence our second panel of the day. So as you know, our panel's title is the UN's Conflict Management between Peacekeeping, Prevention, Human Rights and Development. This is a massive title that covers a wide range of aspects that the UN has set as its main objectives. Actually, I think we have all the main objectives in this one panel title, right? Because it refers to peace and security, it refers to human rights, it also refers to social progress and development. And obviously in the context of the current critical phase of multilateralism that we have just discussed in the initial panel of today, these issues are very pressing, and this is really what this panel seeks to address. I think we will see, and I think all the three panelists will reflect on that the UN's conflict management has been subject to a massive number of changes and is still constantly being innovated upon. And we need, I think, only think about the practice of peacekeeping, which of course is not mentioned in the UN Charter, but which has become such a massive, of such massive importance for the UN in the past 70 years. And still we're kind of recalibrating what peacekeeping means, what it should be doing, and our idea of what peacekeeping is keeps evolving and changing. Luckily, we have three very able panelists to guide us through this interesting discussion, who I will now introduce, and we will go in the order of how they are listed in the program. So our first speaker will be Michael Lollesgaard, who has extensive experience in the military, in the Danish military, and of course also has served as Force Commander of MINUSMA, so the UN Peacekeeping mission in Mali. He is currently the Danish military representative to the EU and NATO. And Michael will, as far as I've heard before starting this panel, talk to us mostly about robust peacekeeping and of course reflecting on his experiences in Mali. Our second speaker is Professor Emily Paddon Rhoads. She's an assistant professor at Swarthmore College in Pennsylvania, as I've just found out, if you're wondering where this was. Professor Rhoads holds a PhD from the University of Oxford and is a scholar who's mainly interested in the issue of peacekeeping and human rights, and also how this relates to norms. And she has written a very well-received book on impartiality, in particular, in peacekeeping, and how our thinking about this has evolved in practice. And then finally, we will hear from Bertrand Ramcharan, who has a very distinguished long career in the UN system that has too many posts that I could mention now in the short introduction. But he has worked, for example, at the Department of Political Affairs, and one of the senior roles that he has held was as Deputy and then Acting UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. And then he also has a long distinguished academic career, academic output to build on in his remarks. So he brings really this combination between practitioner and scholar to the table. So without further ado, I will now hand over to my three speakers, and we will start with Lieutenant General Michael Lollesgaard, please.
Thank you. I don't know if there's any light, probably. Yes, good. Dear all, Excellencies, dear Troels, thank you very much for inviting me to this very interesting seminar, and maybe also very timely seminar, because I think, especially here in Denmark, we need to discuss UN, and for my sake, UN peacekeeping. What do we generally think about it? How do we support it, and how do we improve it? Generally, we can say, I guess, that we have forgotten more about peacekeeping than we know today. I'm wearing my uniform today because I am military, but I was happy to be also called an analyst. That's the first time, but that's very nice. But I think some of you will also be disappointed maybe afterwards, because I would actually speak more about the primacy of politics. And in this regard, I will support some of Elmer Grete's views, but I will also disagree maybe in a few others. But that's how it was when we were together in New York almost 20 years ago. As I said in the introduction, I was deployed in MINUSMA in 2015 and 16, and since then I've been involved in a number of seminars focusing on the military part of peacekeeping, how to improve training, how to adapt the mindset of peacekeepers to the new realities on the ground, how to improve generally the capabilities of the peacekeeping forces, and how, and not least, to improve peacekeeping intelligence. There are many flaws in today's UN peacekeeping, but I believe they can be overcome if we want and if we show the right leadership on all levels. I'm a great fan of UN peacekeeping, as UN action before, during, or even after a conflict or a crisis are needed, because this is the only tool available to do something. I would claim that UN peacekeeping, even though there's a lot of arguments against it, has had more successes than failures. Look at Liberia, Sierra Leone, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Côte d'Ivoire, East Timor, and more. So is it relevant? And I believe that it is, but we also have to realize that there's no one-size-fits-all. Almost every conflict is different from the others. But with the available and flexible peacekeeping tool that we have at hand, we can establish a proper operation capable of containing a conflict and bring it forward towards a political solution. In the next session, we will hear on the status on the UN reforms, and I will not go into too much details on the reforms, but just highlight one issue that I find is the most important. Success of a mission, as General Margrethe said, depends on an active political process with the commitment of the stakeholders. I'll try to put that in the Malian context, since that's the one I knew the best. In 2015 and 16, when I was in Mali, there was, I would say, no prominent progress, to say it at least. We had close to 40 soldiers and UN civilians killed in action. The number of attacks from the terrorists were going up. Schools continued to be closed in the northern Mali. Imagine a population where schools have been closed for 4 years, no education. Almost no local or regional authorities were established. No former fighters were disarmed, and the humanitarian needs were increasing. That's kind of the results of the 2 years that I was there. Why was it? Why was it, considering actually we had plenty of international attention? We had a regional engagement by the different regional organizations, by the neighboring countries. We have plenty of donor money, but best of all, in Mali, we had a peace agreement that was signed by the 3 parties, the government, the coordination, which was an umbrella group or an umbrella organization of the former rebel Tuaregs and Arabic groups, and the platform, the pro-government rebels. With that peace agreement, we had a good agreed basis to disarm, demobilize, and reintegrate the former fighters. We had in the agreement a good plan to integrate the former warring parties into the local and regional authorities. And we had a plan to establish a platform for, among others, the reconciliation talks that would lead to elections. So why did we not succeed? What went wrong? Was it the mandate? Was it confused? Was it too, or perhaps overly ambitious, as El Margrethe talked about? Was it this Christmas tree? Actually, I would say no. The mandate was quite clear, with an emphasis on the implementation of the peace agreement. That was the basis of it, everything. Of course, there was the task of protection of civilians, supporting the human rights, delivering humanitarian aid, which, by the way, should not be a specific task, but an implied task for all missions. In essence, in a peacekeeping mission, we are only there for the sake of the people. to protect them from attacks, to protect them from violations of human rights, and to make sure that their basic needs are or will be met. In Mali, that's maybe a little bit curious, on top of that we initially had the task of protecting cultural heritage and supporting the protection of the Gourma elephants. However, I will claim that these additional tasks were not blurring the overall focus on the implementation of the peace agreement. So the mandate was clear and rather focused. So why did we not succeed? Was it because of the lack of capabilities within the force and the police? No. I would claim that that was not a deciding factor in the lack of progress. Of course, the force was covering a way too big area, the size of France with 12,000 troops. We were thin on the ground, and the training levels and capabilities were far behind what could be considered reasonable in an environment with a substantial terrorist threat. When I, in the spring of 2016, suggested a raise in the troop level of approximately 2,000 soldiers, including additional helicopters, intelligence unit, and special forces, I was asked by the US ambassador if this would change the dynamics in the conflict. And I had to answer, no, but I will be better at protecting the civilians. I will be better at protecting the force, and perhaps I will be better at acting more proactive to threats. So basically, we will have, if we get the forces, we will have fewer fatalities, but overall, the dynamics will only change if we manage to revitalize the political process. And, Madam Ambassador, I said, this is also your responsibility. So we come back to the Security Council again. So I strongly believed and still believe that there's no military solution to the problems. We have to work towards a political settlement while the military and the police stabilize the situation on the ground and thereby create the preconditions for negotiations, i.e. by creating and maintaining a safe and secure environment. I would say, though, that Elmargrethe suggested that we should have maybe an evolving mandate. If that has something to do with the troop levels, I would caution against that, because fourth generation in the UN, unfortunately, is very, very slow. I asked for protection, for convoy protection in 2015. Still, that force is not in place. And that was a force of 650 people specialized to do convoy escorting. So we can maybe make evolving mandates, but if that implies changing the troop levels, we have to realize that fourth generation is very slow. We had many losses. I mentioned 40 killed soldiers, UN soldiers and civilians. Should we have had a counterterrorism mandate? Should we have gone directly after the terrorists? That is a huge discussion in itself, and many scholars are writing articles about it in different issues, but I don't believe that the UN force in the short term will have the capabilities within intelligence gathering and tactical mobility to be an effective counterterrorism force. But moreover, and more important, I believe the whole question of impartiality could be questions and the legitimacy of the force. So therefore, this element, counterterrorism, because somebody needs to do something about it, should be left to another player. In the case of Mali, it was the French forces. It could also be a regional force, coordinated, of course, with the UN efforts. So why did we not progress in the implementation of the peace agreement? I will be blunt and generally say lack of leadership. Not at the level of individuals, but more at the level of institutions and through the lack of coherent actions of the international community. Let's start from the top. The Security Council, in my assessment, for too long accepted a limited buy-in from the Malian government and from the armed groups who were parties to the agreement. It was more or less accepted that small and what seemed insignificant issues were allowed to delay the whole process. As stated by the Secretary General, and I quote, "For particularly the governments, the Council has a vital role in securing the commitment and cooperation. I believe that clear milestones and benchmarks should be defined. Some have talked about the possibility of establishing a compact with the government. That could be one way. And then the Council needs to be tough. Possible sanctions against spoilers were from the early on a part of the MINUSMA mandate, but it was only very, very late, after several years, that the Council started discussing actually applying these sanctions. Another element of the lack of leadership was in the construct of the peace agreement implementation. Algeria played a strong and important role as interlocutors in the establishment of the peace agreement. But I'm not sure it was the best decision to have the neighboring country playing a leading role in the implementation of the peace agreement. It created a blurred picture with Algeria at the end of the table of a committee, the Committee de Suivi, which also had the participation of regional organizations, AU, ECOWAS, EU, and larger countries such as US and France. And the UN was only the daily support and facilitator with no direct responsibility nor authority in the implementation. I believe this construction was created with the best intention of inclusion of all parties, but it failed to act as a leader on the ground. And because of the lack of overall leadership, the pressure on the different parties was weak, whereby they were allowed to pursue their own agendas. A little on the specific construction in the peacekeeping missions. I believe that the integrated mission concept is right. A civilian chief, special representative of the Secretary General, and then the four pillars, the political, the development humanitarian, the police, and the force. But in most missions, I believe the political pillar should be the first amongst equals. This pillar should, for the other pillars, drive priorities and operationalize the agreed benchmarks and focus areas. In MINUSMA, we could have done a better job by having a proper, what we in military call a campaign plan, which coordinates all efforts in time and space. But the prerogative for a good campaign plan is that you're also in control of the process, which we were not. To end on the same note as I started, UN peacekeeping, I believe, is still relevant. Some say that sometimes we should only call it freeze-keeping, as it only freezes a situation. But that's also a good start. And as long as we are strongly together working to find a long-term political solution to the problems in the area. I think we can change that. We just need to put our lessons together and then apply the key elements, what I say, cohesion and leadership at all levels. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. I think it was an excellent analysis that you led us through here. And now we'll hear from Professor Rhodes, please.
Thank you very much. I want to begin by thanking the organizers. Nice to meet you. I haven't had a chance to shake your hand yet, for inviting me to this symposium, this very timely symposium. It's really an honor to be here today and to speak to all of you and to share this panel with my fellow panelists. One of my favorite books about the UN was written by the late Irish statesman Conor Cruz O'Brien. And in it, Conor Cruz O'Brien described the UN as sacred drama, a theatrical construction with a profoundly theological content. He said that the creation of the UN in 1945, following the ravages of 2 world wars, represented nothing less than humanity's prayer to itself to be saved from itself. In the name of we, the peoples of the United Nations, the famous opening words of the Charter offer the sacred prayer, reaffirming faith in fundamental human rights and expressing its members' commitment to renounce the use of armed force save in the common interest. The power and promise of this post-war exhortation lay in the universality of the UN's membership, which was unprecedented, and the belief that for the first time all peoples would be governed by the same rules. However, and it's a big however, the Charter's idealism was, and still is, tempered by a good dose of realism. A pragmatism seen most visibly in the primacy accorded to the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, as we've heard about this morning, and the expectation that they would manage peace and security through a modicum of political consensus. As this morning's opening panel captured, I think, so well for us, this rules-based order is under great pressure, not least because that consensus is seemingly elusive today. In the time that I have, I'm going to spend a bit of time looking at how these broader dynamics, some of which are new and some of which are not so new, are playing out in the particular realm of UN peace operations. And I'm going to do that by outlining some of the contemporary challenges and dilemmas faced by the UN on the ground in places like the Democratic Republic of Congo and South Sudan, places that I've spent much of the last 10 years researching. I'll consider the implications for the UN more broadly going forward, and I'm going to conclude with some preliminary thoughts of where I think we might go from here. But first, I want to say a few very brief words about the evolving nature of peacekeeping, which I think are warranted. Peacekeeping, as Ingvild noted at the beginning, was of course not foreseen by the authors of the Charter. It emerged during the Cold War as a radical experiment in international cooperation, and it became quite quickly a mainstay of the organization. And like its institutional progenitor, it too is predicated on a degree of political consensus. During the Cold War, that meant that peacekeeping was very limited in its ambition. UN forces, lightly armed and donning blue berets, carried out a very limited number of unintrusive tasks, observing frontiers, monitoring troop deployments, largely between states. Their authority was limited to that which the parties of the conflict and arguably also the Security Council conferred on them through their mandates. That all changed in the post-Cold War period, and particularly after a string of crises in the 1990s prompted a rethinking, a reformulation of peacekeeping, as well as arguably the UN's purposes more generally. Like other areas of international engagement, peacekeeping expanded and expanded very rapidly, becoming more normatively ambitious with thematic issues such as the protection of civilians, which became a high, some would argue, the highest priority for UN forces. Since 1999, UN forces have been charged almost universally with a responsibility to protect civilians from peril and to penalize perpetrators with force, sometimes lethal force, regardless, more recently, of who the aggressor may be. We see this also in the emergence of the responsibility to protect principle, which came about at the turn of the new millennium, and more recently, the Human Rights Upfront Initiative. And yet, despite the institutionalization of the protection imperative, despite the development of much policy, doctrine, and I would argue excellent guidance, challenges, very real challenges remain. Why is this? At the global level, increased geopolitical rivalry, resurgent nationalism in recent years, as well as growing skepticism about international intervention, both in terms of the prospects for success, as well as who should shoulder the burden of these interventions, has occasioned a more statist understanding, I would argue, of protection, one that dilutes the individual ethical imperative and the idea that the international community has a responsibility to protect individuals. China and Russia, as well as a number of peacekeeping's main troop-contributing countries, TCCs, increasingly emphasize the state-centric elements of protection. And for those of you in the room who are international relations scholars, protection is a norm, and it's a very vague norm, which engenders this contestation. Namely, these states emphasize that states themselves are the primary agents of protection, that the goal of international actors should be to enhance state capacity, that states should have to request protection and not have protection forced upon them. These are, of course, very important dimensions of protection. The state is ultimately the guarantor of protection and should be over the long run. But they're challenging, given that states are often themselves the perpetrator of violence towards civilians. What is more, the shift in emphasis, recent shift in emphasis, points to a lack of consensus, whereby actors increasingly mean very different things when they speak about and when they do protection. This has impacted peacekeeping practice at the field level. We see gross inconsistencies in how mandates are implemented. While peacekeepers have intensified their involvement in a wide range of activities that can be called protection, things like promotion of the rule of law and human rights monitoring, the record on uses of force to protect civilians in imminent danger is far more mixed. Civilians are protected in some instances and often not in others. Overstretched and under-resourced troop-contributing countries are often reluctant to use force, and national caveats, which create a de facto dual line of command between some troop-contributing countries and their own governments, continue to be a pressing issue. We also see increasingly strained relationships between UN missions and governments, the governments that host them, particularly in places like the Democratic Republic of Congo and South Sudan, where elements of the state are or have been involved in perpetrating abuses against civilians. Here, UN officials have struggled to balance their state-building functions of their mandate, as well as the need for continuing host state consents for their very presence, with their human rights and protection mandate and obligations. The result at times has been greater government intransigence. In a number of contexts, UN access has been greatly curtailed, as has been the case very prominently in South Sudan. Staff have been expelled from countries, and the missions have been accused by all sides at various points as being partial. The ability of the UN to respond assertively and really to hold a firm line when governments take this more kind of robust combative approach has arguably been compromised by the absence of a strong and unified Security Council backing, as we just heard about in the context of Mali. And finally, and perhaps I would argue most importantly, these dynamics have over time negatively impacted the UN's ability to act and be accepted as a political arbiter. In both Congo and South Sudan, the mission's influence and leverage has been limited, and the UN has at times been marginalized from the very political processes that many experts would argue are the only path to lasting peace and meaningful protection. In 2004, for example, the mission in South Sudan was largely excluded from peace talks between the government in South Sudan and the SPLM in opposition, which were mediated by a regional group, the IGAD. More recently, UNMISS officials criticized the failure of IGAD and the Council to consult the mission during the development of a 4,000-strong regional peacekeeping force, what was itself a response partly to the failures of UN peacekeepers on the ground to protect civilians during the 2016 Juba crisis. Like the Force Intervention Brigade, the FIB, deployed in Congo in 2013, the RPF was arguably authorized from a position of weakness, an admission that the UN was having difficulties able to deliver on its mandate, and an acknowledgement, or at least the stepping in, of the primacy of regional actors increasingly in these contexts. These challenges and the underlying dynamics which give rise to them are not entirely new. They did not begin with the election of Trump or Brexit, and this is both good and bad. It is good because it suggests that peacekeeping as an institution arguably has a certain degree of resilience. While analysts are quick to proclaim that peacekeeping is in crisis, there's a constant crisis that analysts are proclaiming peacekeeping to be in, peacekeeping actually continues to grow, and some would argue that today it's in fairly robust form. And I would argue that in the last 5 years in particular, there's been a surfeit of really great conceptual thinking, really deep thinking that has elevated the primacy of politics onto the peacekeeping agenda, which wasn't there before. It's a fairly recent appreciation of how central politics needs to be from multiple corners within the UN as an institution. Less positive is the fact that peacekeeping's persistence, I would argue, is partly because it has been an area of international engagement where states, and particularly the P5, have for the most part been able to paper over their differences until recently. The fact that peacekeeping is something of a hydra-headed institution is an enabler of this, because it means that no single actor is forced, let alone able, to assume the complete costs, political or otherwise, of a collective UN decision. This partializing of burdens has greatly increased the likelihood of posturing and political evasion in peacekeeping, as in other areas of multilateral engagement, and chief among this have been the role of the Council, issuing mandates that are very difficult to implement at the field level. But it's also been part of why peacekeeping has continued to survive and arguably thrive. There are signs, however, that global tensions and the breakdown of liberal international order may be spilling over into peacekeeping in ways that I think could be characterized as new, and I'm going to highlight very briefly two. First, Moscow's assertive recent engagement in various peacekeeping debates, particularly around mandate renewals, its insistence last year that the Council endorse in renewing the mandate for the Central African Republic, that it endorse a Sudanese Russian effort to mediate the conflict in Central African Republic. More recently, I've been watching quite closely how Russia's been weighing in on Congo's fraught electoral results and being very adamant that they should not be contested. The results should not be contested. For some, this would suggest that arguably, maybe, peacekeeping is becoming increasingly a more pronounced forum for states within the Security Council, particularly the P5, to stake out a kind of more competitive role, kind of peacekeeping becoming more of a contest around broader geopolitical rivalry and dynamics. Secondly, as the US under Trump pulls back from some of its commitments, and as even just the signaling power of having the US in the state that it is politically, the US that historically has been somewhat of an advocate for these more ambitious norms like protection, having the US pull back, and what some see as the role of China stepping in, a state that has for a long time been a skeptic of liberal norms such as protection, with that gaining of influence and power, I don't think it's unreasonable to expect that we may see the priorities of peacekeeping change more overtly, more publicly. This raises very real questions about the UN's ability, I would argue, to play a leading role in protection and the promotion of human rights in this context of broader geopolitical tensions, in part because of the risk of it being seen as partial, both at the field level and at the global level. Continuing on with the normative ambition of recent years, while laudable in principle, and I'm a huge advocate for human rights, would arguably, in the increasingly fraught global context, not be without costs, and I think could potentially lead to the UN's further marginalization amidst this context of polarization. The moment we find ourselves in today is arguably evokes some of this fragility and uncertainty that Conor Cruz O'Brien alluded to in the immediate aftermath of World War II, and which really led to the founding of the United Nations. The need for such an international body today for an answer to humanity's prayer may be no less urgent. Back then, in many respects, the world was far simpler, delineated by two emerging sides and a nascent Cold War. Today's scrambling of allegiances, domestic crises in two of the West's democratic pillars, England's current debacle around Brexit and the US's government shutdown, and the growing appeal of authoritarian and illiberal ways of governing make a common call for the universal principles that an organization like the UN espouses all the less likely, however great the need for such a body. It is in this environment, I would argue, that perhaps the best case the UN can have for making itself relevant going forward will be through things like its good offices, its role as a mediating power, as a convening power, which we're going to hear a little bit more about this afternoon. And this is not to say that human rights or protection should be abandoned or that they do not have a place within the UN. I think they do. They can, they should, and they are a part of the UN. They're in the Charter. But I would argue what is arguably more needed is a more nimble and pragmatic approach to peacekeeping and arguably the UN's involvement in international politics more generally right now, one that recognizes seriously the potential pitfalls and perils of this destabilized order.
for this, Emily, and this gives us the perfect transition to our final speaker, because you were reflecting a lot on human rights and also on the issue of prevention and mediation, which I believe Bertrand Ramcharan will now tell us more about. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I want to address, if I may, 4 themes, linking them to the discussions that have preceded us. We were told this morning by the distinguished professor that we should perhaps have a perspective of the UN in 3 volets, the General Assembly, the Security Council, and what he called the networks of the Secretariat and civil society organizations. I'd like to ask the following question. If the security threats are emerging in such a manner that we need executive authority, how can we possibly contemplate that we would downplay the role of the Security Council? I just put that question there on the floor. And then our friend Tom Weiss raised the question, should the Secretary General be saying that there are some things that can be done or that some things that cannot be done? And I think this is a very important question. I don't know if it's published yet, but I was asked to write an assessment of the first 2 years of this Secretary General. And I wrote 3,000 words in global governance. And I say that we have to look at the United Nations in terms of 4 baskets. The basket of peace, the basket of development, the basket of human rights and humanitarianism, and the basket of the international civil service. And I was somewhat diplomatic in my language in this piece, but when I ask myself the question, what are the new ideas in the peace basket? I don't really see new ideas. I see slogans. In the development basket, there are the Sustainable Development Goals, and they're concrete. And those who are better specialists than I am will answer the question, might it be necessary for the United Nations or the Secretary General to identify sharper, more achievable goals? For example, Ban Ki-moon had this with Paul Collier. At one stage, he was emphasizing the issue of the plight of the poorest. And can societies do more for their poorest? And then now, in the debate that is taking place between our distinguished ambassador, our distinguished general here, I must tell you that I performed the functions of a director in the political department, and for 3.5 years I was with the mediators and peacekeepers in the former Yugoslavia. And I remember Thorvald Stoltenberg, who passed away last year. His best friend was Torkel Upsal, and Torkel put him under a lot of pressure when Stoltenberg was the SRSG of the largest peacekeeping operation in the history of the United Nations, unto 44,000. Torkel put him under pressure to say, Thorvald, you have to do something about the human rights abuses. And I sat with the Force Commander on this issue, and cut a long story short, it was out of this process that the first human rights component of a peacekeeping operation came into existence. And so in this debate, if I may say, between the two of you, I ask myself the question, I have much understanding for you that you need a practical mission on the ground. At the same time, from where I'm coming from, you must have a vision and a strategy for the country. And how we balance these two things, perhaps one should not burden the SRSG with these things, but somewhere in the system, there must be a strategy because if you don't have a strategy to prevent the breakdown of the peace, you're in a loser's game. So now, having forced these comments on the previous participants in this meeting, I want to ask the question, can history help us in the situation that we are in right now? Well, now, when I seek to answer this question, Tom Weiss was speaking and others were speaking about the political moment and the powers and whatnot. When Hammarskjöld became Secretary General, I'm not watching my clock, so you will tell me when my 12 minutes are over. When Hammarskjöld became Secretary General, he had a vision for the United Nations. The United Nations for him would be a United Nations in the service of the developing countries. And in the course of this, and not in the course of that, as he went along, Hammarskjöld brought in the notion of preventive diplomacy, and he brought in the notion of peacekeeping. And Hammarskjöld's idea of preventive diplomacy is that it would apply in situations that were not affected by the great powers. So the rest of, I just look at the conceptual leadership of Hammarskjöld there. The next Secretary General I want to place before you is Sgs Reform. At the time, I was the head of the speechwriting service, and I couldn't get him to say a single thing of value. And I was very critical of him in my own mind, but his discipline served the United Nations so well. It was the time of the Cold War, and as the Cold War ended, he could play a role in bringing the conflict in Iraq, helping to bring the conflict in Iraq to an end. I just take some water. So, yeah. Now, the question I'm addressing here now is, can history help us? Sgs Reform's discipline served the United Nations rather well. When I was the head of the speechwriting service, I read a book published in Australia called The Minister's Minders. And this book argued that a prime minister or a head of a department of government will succeed if the head can identify 2 or 3 major objectives. And a friend of mine, whom I interviewed recently, he told me that Ban Ki-moon once met Lee Kuan Yew, one of the greatest strategists of our times. And he made a note of this meeting, but unfortunately I have not been able to get it out of him yet. And Ban Ki-moon asked Lee Kuan Yew, "What advice would you have for me?" And Lee Kuan Yew said to him, "Pick 1 or 2 big issues and go after them." So now, from the point of view of history, I'm saying to you 2 things. First, even when the going is rough, a thoughtful, conceptual, thinking Secretary General can be of much help. I have to place before you the thought that I did not put in my comment on the current Secretary General. The current Secretary General is engaging in a lot of tinkering and a lot of slogans, if I may say so. This action for peacekeeping, it may mean, well, sustainable peace, a platform for prevention. I do not find them strategic ideas. I find them tinkering ideas. I'll leave that aside. History and discipline. Now comes the question of the agenda. If I am faithful to the thought that one must have in mind an agenda that can perhaps help to take the organization forward, I would like to place before you some thoughts, whether you agree with them or not, and it is your prerogative to disagree, and it is my prerogative to put them before you. In my view, the United Nations should be engaged in a global watch over human security. This is a concept that was put before the United Nations in 1987 by Secretary General Sgs Reform, and it is very relevant to our times, and it calls for new diplomacy. In my view, we need to be promoting dialogue among the great powers. Ask yourself this question. At one time, there was a Helsinki process, and there is nothing now, as far as I'm aware, that matches the Helsinki process insofar as the relations with Russia are concerned. And I'm not aware of anything that exists vis-a-vis China and the US. And if you take the book by John Mearsheimer, The Tragedy of Great Power Politics, and if you compare it with the book by Kissinger on China, Mearsheimer thinks that they're bound to fight, and Kissinger thinks not necessarily. And I'm saying to you, do we not need some form of diplomacy here? And then there is this issue of better governance in member states. All of the issues we are talking about, the root causes come back to this issue of the need for better governance in member states. And then I've already mentioned something to you, alleviating the plight of the poorest. You know, I was born and raised in a country, called British Guyana. We're a country of less than 1 million people. And we have poverty, and we don't need to have poverty, because we can deal, if we had better governance, with the plight of the poor. And then, of course, the former Deputy Secretary General, and if I may say so, my good friend Jan Ellison is here. Humanitarian assistance, that will always be a part of the agenda of the United Nations. And I still remember, Jan, when you negotiated this resolution that led to the establishment of the Department for Humanitarian Affairs, the principles that you distilled for humanitarian operations, it was a great exercise. And then, of course, my last point would be the United Nations must be engaged in the business of helping countries to enhance their national protection systems. You can talk as much as you wish at the international level, unless the protection of human rights is taking place within countries, you're in a loser's game. So now, so far I've addressed the issue of history, and I've addressed the issue of agenda. I want to talk a bit, because the organizers have talked me in the direction of prevention and human rights, so I will say a bit about prevention. I told you that Hammarskjöld's idea was that he would go in for preventive diplomacy on situations where the great powers were not involved. And then Secretary General Pérez de Cuellar started in 1985 the Jodidi lecture at Harvard. Okay, my time is over. So. Well, how can I talk about prevention? Let me take 2 minutes, if I may. Yes, okay. Prevention. Secretary, go to fast forward to Agenda for Peace. I wrote the first draft of Agenda for Peace, not the final draft. And I was a political director. And it can be done. One has to be watchful for situations where one can be helpful. But it's not an easy thing to achieve. I may develop that if one of you asks me a relevant question, I will exploit it and tell you a bit more about prevention. And then now human rights. I want to make this point. I think that if peacekeeping is divorced from human rights, it'll be devoid of purpose. Where is Tulls? Tulls has written I thumbed through his dissertation last night, and he makes a very interesting case about the nexus between human rights and security and human rights. Well, I have to tell you this. I wrote a book called Human Rights in UN Peace Operations, in Yugoslavia, so I have to invite you to read my book. Thank you.
Thank you so much. My name is Fred Harhoff, and I would like to start out by thanking the three speakers for their interventions. Do I have to eat it? Thanks to the three speakers for their interventions. My name is Fred Harhoff. I used to be a judge at the UN International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, and I'm also a professor of international law. I had two questions. I'm not sure to which I should put it, so I'll put it to all three of you. The first question relates to the role or the importance, or perhaps the usefulness, of the international legal order. It is, of course, an inherent part of the UN, but also it is an independent platform for international cooperation. And my fear is, and this is why I'm asking, that we are moving towards a new international order in which the big powers, the superpowers, are going to decide things on the international legal level the way they want, and in complete disregard, or more or less complete disregard, for the voice and the role of smaller and poorer countries. What impact will that development, if I'm right, have on the development of international law in the future? The second question relates to something which I've been looking for in vain on all the titles for this conference, namely justice. I would have thought that peace and security are closely related to justice, but I haven't seen anything about it so far, and I haven't heard anything. So I'd like to raise the issue about what are we to do for international justice, not only in relation to the violations that come out of the wars, which General Lollesgaard and others have been responsible for trying to solve, or to at least calm down, on the individual level, so international, individual criminal responsibility, but also on the general level of state responsibility. I mean, what are we supposed to make of China's complete disregard of the UN Arbitration Court's determination of the role of China in the South China Sea? We can't just sit back and do nothing, or can we? Thanks.
Just a very quick comment. I think there's no disagreement between Michael and me in terms of the priorities for the mandate of a peacekeeping mission. It's very interesting that the title is Between Peacekeeping, Prevention, Human Rights and Development, and none of you have talked about development. And that is where I think the Council asked us to move forward much too quickly. As I said, protection of civilian is crucial, and you cannot discuss protection of civilian without having the human rights component. But basically what the main task of the mission is to try and establish and keep the peace, and then leave space for other actors to build the peace, and that is a lot of development issues, and too much is getting into the mandates, and it creates a lot of problem for integrated peacekeeping missions if we are being implementing partners that rather, for activities that rather should have been left to my colleague on the back, the UNDP and the other UN organization. We can be the coordinator but not the implementer, and that's what I mean when I talk about these big mandates. And it actually relates to the question of creating a justice system in the country. I mean, in Liberia, our justice rule of law section tried to work on creating the justice sector in Liberia, but sorry to say, we had to work, and you have to work with others who stay behind after the mission leaves. It takes 30 years at least to build a rule of law sector if everything has broken down. So you have to lay the seeds, but realize others have to finish.
Right, let's just have one last question by the gentleman behind.
Thank you. My name is Finn Nielsen. Decades in the UN, including in peacekeeping. Now I'm active in the UN, Danish UN Association. I won't take up that challenge, but I had two very specific questions that were not really touched on. One is, and this is addressed mostly to General Lollesgaard, are UN uniform peacekeepers really up to the task or not? And if not, why not? What does it take? Second question is linked in with what Ilmeride mentioned, and that is the question of the Secretary General's current reform program and the attempt at bringing the different parts of the system closer together. Nobody talked about that, and I'd like to hear what your assessment is, because if it doesn't work, we're in trouble.
Thank you. So I would suggest that we will start with Emily and then go to Michael and then finish off with Bertrand. Thank you. You can pick and choose what you want to focus on, I suppose.
I'm going to tackle an element of the very large justice set of questions, which I think are really absolutely critical, and which I am definitely not placed to answer in fulsome in any way. But I will say one thing, that I'm not a legal scholar, and the
question of the future of the role of the international legal order is a very important one, but also a massive one. I will say one thing that I've observed in some of the contexts that I've been doing research, which is how justice is understood and perceived at the local level. And this relates to a point that was raised in the last panel about bridging the gap between these global institutions and people in conflict-affected and post-conflict states. Phil Clark has a book that has just come out. He's a professor at SOAS in London, called Distant Justice. And much of the book is focused on looking at how, particularly the International Criminal Court is viewed by people within the contexts in which it has tried cases. And one of the challenges that he identifies is that it is very difficult to make justice in The Hague meaningful at the very local level, and that there's a huge gap between institutions, how they're perceived, how they're understood, and how they're seen to deliver on some of their objectives. And so I think one aspect of the justice question is how do we think about justice not just from the global level in terms of making sure states meet their responsibilities, but also how do we make the pursuit of justice at the international level meaningful?
Thank you. Let me focus on the military parts of the questions, maybe. You asked about the Santa Cruz report, and I think I fully agree with the content of the report. And those of you who hasn't knowledge of it, it states that the peacekeepers need to be better at protecting ourselves. We need to have better camps. We need better equipment. We need to be more proactive, and so on. And I can agree with the report because my end of mission report was probably with the same content, but as it was very critical, it was not publicized on the UN web pages. So I fully agree. How do we do it better then? How do we improve peacekeeping? I think there are good initiatives. We're now making this readiness system where we are checking and certifying units before that they have the right equipment, they have the right training and so on, before they are going into the mission. The problem with Mali, and why we started out on a very, very low level, was that we were doing the reheading. So it was an AU-led mission, the AFISMA, with very, very poor troops that were in country, and from one day to the other, a blue helmet or blue beret on, and we started very low. So they were in non-protected vehicles, no training whatsoever in the code of conduct of UN forces, no camps. It was tents without air conditioning and so on. So we actually had to improve the troops in Mali as we were running the operations. But I think it is noted, and I think that there are several initiatives on how can we improve through partnerships and so on, the poor countries. Because the problem is now in UN peacekeeping, the willing are not the most capable, and the capable are not the willing. So this is the problem. So we need to make sure that we are establishing these partnerships so we can make the willing capable. They deserve it. And I cried for every loss I had, and I would say half of the losses could have been avoided with better training, better equipment.
Thank you. I'm going to take each of these questions briefly. The Sgs Reform Program. I'd make two comments on that. First of all, the SGs brought in reforms, as we know, in three main areas. Restructuring of the political and peacekeeping departments. Within that process, shared regional divisions. I think we have to allow some time to see whether what the results of this will be. So, to be fair, give them time. I have some views on that, but I will not express them. Now, I think I should make the comment that organizational tinkering cannot substitute for strategy. And I do not see strategy so far. If you look at the SG's last annual report, he has a long list of things where he's brought in reforms. And I do not mean to be unkind. I'm respectful of Secretary General. It is the nature. I've spent 33 years in the UN. But I find this a little bit of sloganeering, so I'll leave it to that. Then I take the two questions, the usefulness of the international legal order and what role for justice. I have two comments on that. And the first comment is that at the end of the day, we have to give the International Court of Justice time to play its role. Now, I wrote a book recently, which I will not publish, called China's International Human Rights Policies. And when I researched this book, I came across a lecture by the Chinese judge at the International Court of Justice, Justice Su Hanqian. And she says this, that we in China believe in universal human rights applied in the context of socialism with Chinese characteristics. Well now, so I leave it there. Then now this issue of the usefulness of the what role for justice, that's a much difficult question. Let me just make this comment. Whatever role the Secretary General plays, I think he should be a voice for universality, and he should be a voice for international legality. He cannot confront the major powers, but he can at least be a voice for these things. And then the last question, what role for OHCHR in prevention? Well, you know, my friend, I just happened to see last week a paper in draft. The High Commissioner has said publicly, she's been asked by the Secretary General to come up with a plan for prevention. And what I've seen, if I may say so with respect, is a plan that basically argues the case for mainstreaming human rights in UN processes. And I respect that. To me, prevention has to take place within countries. And Tom Weiss, who was kindly sponsored a book of mine which came out a few years ago, Preventive Human Rights Strategies. I have thoughts on this, but I will not belabor you with them. But I actually think that, let me put some concrete thoughts before you. I think that the High Commission should be saying under the Universal Periodic Review process, my Secretariat report will highlight the issue of prevention within countries. And the High Commission should be asking the treaty bodies, please pay attention to prevention. And the High Commission should be asking national human rights commissions, please highlight prevention. I think for me, these are three practical things. I was a loyal 33-year career person, and I understand the case for mainstreaming. But mainstreaming can come, what did the gentleman say? He said, freekeeping or peacekeeping. So mainstreaming can become non-streaming. So I'll stop there.
Right, I think we have time for one really quick last question. I don't know, Tom, did you want to? I saw you raised your hand earlier. Right.
I just wanted to try to put together something that Ellen said this morning that Emily pushed us toward, that is a pragmatic, resilient peacekeeping. And I wanted to know whether the protection of cultural heritage for the first time in Mali is such an adaptation or not, as you see it from the ground.
Yes, it goes directly to Emily, but then maybe also Michael can
Actually, I think it should be on the bottom line of our priorities. I think we should not use too much attention on these issues if we are short of resources, if we are. And this is part of the Christmas tree. Of course, we can facilitate elements, we can facilitate that something is done, we can do a little bit protection, but I think taking it as a new form or a new task and so on, I think it is taking it too far, especially with the resource constraints that we had.
Okay, unfortunately, this elapses our time, and sorry for these people who couldn't ask their questions. But as the lunch break is coming up, you might get a chance to speak to our panelists in a more private setting over a sandwich. So we will see you back here in this room at